Hello and welcome to my ABLE Assembly presentation, Whole Body Learning, Making Trauma-Informed Education Universal. My name is Abby Neale. I'm a teaching artist. I use they, them pronouns, and I teach visual arts and carpentry in the Boston Public Schools through a teaching artist program hosted by the Elliott School of Fine and Applied Arts. Okay, so here's the plan for my presentation. We're going to start with key terms and essential vocabulary, observe how trauma affects the brain. I'll share this emotional first aid routine that I use almost every day in my art room, some other class routines and practical stuff. Then we will engage in 2 participatory trauma-centered art projects. Okay, we're moving into key terms, starting with the American Psychological Association's definition for trauma. They define trauma as an emotional response to a really terrible, life-altering event. And immediately after, there's denial and shock, followed by long-term flashbacks and a strain on relationships. Now let's talk ACEs. This is a really common vocabulary word around trauma-informed youth work. It stands for adverse childhood events. And this is developed by the Center for Disease Control in the United States. It's more of a clinical approach. They categorize traumatic events into the ACEs, but it's important to note that this is not a definitive list. And these intersect with forms of systemic oppression like race, class, poverty, a global pandemic. But it's more like a starting point, and they can stack onto the shoulders of students, one after the other, creating a heavier burden. The CDC links these to issues including, sadly, depression, suicide, anxiety, addiction, and school dropout. Okay, here we are. So now there are different types of trauma that are important to pull out, and we're going to devote some time to making graphic organizers about this. There's acute, which is about a single event. Chronic, which is multiple events or a prolonged event. Complex, which occurs in a trusted relationship over a long period of time. Generational, which is the transmission of an experience through generations. That's usually linked to systemic oppression, like racism in the United States, for example, or like a big global event can also do that too. Secondary trauma is the last one. This is prevalent in caretakers and educators, including myself. Now, I welcome you to, if it's helpful, pause the video here and take a minute to create a graphic organizer to identify patterns and process all 5 types in however makes sense for you. Take a second to do that. Welcome back. Here is mine. I did a quick and dirty Venn diagram. Notice some patterns that I thought were pretty interesting by doing it. Okay, now you will hear a lot of vocabulary of triggered, activated flashbacks, referring to people experiencing trauma. This means that something has evoked the trauma, and the traumatized person experiences a flashback. The body is responding to the flashback like it's happening in real time, even if it's just reacting to a familiar stimulus. And the body goes into that fight or flight response. Adrenaline is pumping. Now, in healing and coping with trauma, we have 2 ingredients: resilience, which is about the individual person's coping mechanisms and attitudes. This is cultivated through supported community, therapy, and often the arts. protective factors are more about the person's system and support system around them. Healing from trauma requires holistic support, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and also not only that of the traumatized persons, but their support system too, whether that be families, teachers, youth workers. Now, there's something I think a lot of people will encounter in the trauma-informed space, and that is there's the differences in vocabulary. Some folks use like survivor, thriver, victim. I think you should just ask the person who you're talking to what they prefer. Place them at the center of your discussion and you'll probably be golden. I stick to person with trauma or student just because that makes sense for what we're doing. Now let's talk about arts education fitting into all this. One of the reasons art education is really valuable to healing from trauma is that it offers resilience models. A lot of artists make creative work reflecting on their trauma, and this can reduce the stigma and isolation and help people feel seen by the community. It also grounds people in the senses. The immersive process of art making helps the person come back to the world after a flashback and experience really pleasurable sensory experiences. Also, this low stakes play gives an opportunity to rebuild confidence. And often people experience traumatic memories without a linear narrative, more like a collection of sense memories, vignettes, or a series of photographs or lyrics to a song. So that enables the person, art making enables the person to kind of expand their vocabulary around their experience and help them fill in the gaps and lack of confidence that comes from having that fractured memory. Now we're looking at how the brain affects trauma, and I'm hoping this will help us build empathy. And there's this popular thing called the hand model that I'm doing. So you'll notice the hippocampus, which is responsible for identifying the difference between past and present, is unresponsive. That means that memory is processed in the present tense. And the amygdala is overstimulated. That's responsible for memory and threat identification. It becomes overreactive and it sees threat everywhere. Then through the sympathetic nervous system, the body goes into fight or flight mode and is pumped with adrenaline, getting ready to fight, flight, run, or hide. And when a body is in survival mode, it deprioritizes non-survival essentials. So speech and digestion and language processing become deprioritized. So now I'm gonna share my emotional first aid that I do in my classroom almost every day. I learned it from the Boston Children's Hospital. If a student is activated by trauma, I bring in this routine, starting with grounding in the senses, using deep breathing, touching something cold. Some people even use sour cinnamon candy. And that is to kind of disrupt the fear response in the brain and help the student focus on what is actually going on around them. I also then engage in some kind of movement with the kid. Usually I like stretching or going on a walk. You need to release that energy and adrenaline. Then you need a period of rest before having like big serious conversations, because their language is going to take a little bit to come back. So I focus on like yes or no questions. Never expect a full-on conversation or for the student to process consequences until I see that their breathing is slowed down and their body language is neutral. I also am a big fan of asking for consent in personal space, knowing that that student might put their back against the wall or try to hide. And I try to be present and not hyperfixate. So usually I will sit or stand behind or beside that student and kind of face the problem together and maybe model some coping mechanisms so that we are beside each other on equal footing and facing the world together. Now, here's some routines that I've implemented in my classroom after learning all of this. In my classroom, I use what I call either a sensory bin or a busy box. Some classrooms also have beautiful peace corners. And this is different grounding tools that are low key, less distracting. I use wing nuts and bolts to twist and pipe cleaners. And right now I have a Where's Waldo book in there. Depending on circumstances, a chewing gum, mint, sour candies, stress balls, fidgets, all welcome in this kind of context. And I use simple options and take a universal design approach so that I have enough for everyone to use. I also think modeling boundaries is really important with trauma. For example, I talk about private art versus personal. I differentiate private art about big, scary, ugly, vulnerable things that you might keep in like a diary with a little lock and key on it. That's very different from the art you might post on your refrigerator at home or in the hallway bulletin board at school. They're like different contexts for art, and you get to decide. It's your personal space, so you get to decide who you show it to. I also talk about personal space and I model consent. So I ask students to touch their materials that I've handed them, their artwork and their tools and their personal space, such as saying, can I erase that line you said you didn't like on your paper? Is it okay if I use that eraser? I'm also a big fan of a cool down walk. If a student feels hot-headed or overwhelmed, or I just need to get them out of that situation they have created, I will send them on a cool down walk. Usually involves accomplishing a simple task like counting the number of doors, filling up my water bottle. And that gives them kind of a small sense of accomplishment while changing environments and engaging in some of the coping mechanisms. I also mark class transitions as a group with 3 deep breaths. And that really helps things like transitioning into cleanup go a little bit better. And I model a really helpful coping mechanism. Last but not least, the swirl of change. If something unexpected occurs in my classroom, like a fire drill or a half day, my students and I do a column response called the swirl of change. This is where we acknowledge the change, and I make time and space to answer questions because my students are pretty young. A lot of them can't even really read, and they may not remember or have experienced a half day before. So I want to give them time to answer questions and clarify any concerns they have and acknowledge that, yes, a change is occurring and it's different from our normal routine. Okay, now is activity time. I'm going to show you 2 different trauma-informed activities. You are welcome to share your interpretations or your thoughts on the activities in the learning module if you would like. They're on Jamboards. And I think of these activities as seeds for inspiration. You can hack them and transform them into your own teaching practice. So the Safe Spaces project, I started I developed this during the 2020 phase of distance learning in the spring. My students at the time had a lot of questions about the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. And I created a play therapy activity to pair with the restorative justice conversations going on in our school communities about the Black Lives Matter protests that were occurring all over the city. My primarily BIPOC students were observing these protests. They were drawing Black Lives Matter posters, and they were asking questions about why is Black Lives Matter as a statement controversial? I'm Black, I'm brown. Where do I fit in? And if police officers are hurting people, how do I stay safe? Who is a helper in this situation? So I created an activity in collaboration with my classroom teacher partners, inspired by Neale Nodding's book, The Courage to Care in Schools. My students in Zoom art class were invited to bring a small toy or stuffed animal to art. As depicted, my example was our Skylar the Skylark, who was a class pet of sorts. And they use materials from around their homes to create a safe place for this animal. I made the nest out of plastic bags and a broken headphone cable. And this project offered students a role reversal where they were the ones creating the safe space instead of the ones kept safe and sheltered by others. And interesting conversations arose from this. One student said he wanted to be a baby bird in a nest, and then he built himself a nest out of blankets. Another student created a Lego sculpture for a tiny beanie baby and said, this has guns and cameras on it because bad people want to come and get my unicorn because of her colors. So that was one activity. I welcome you to pause if you want and give this activity a try, or talk about how you might spin it for your class and modalities. The next activity I'm going to share is the Resilient Symbols Project. I taught this project first time at Boston's Theater Offensive, which empowers queer youth through theater. And I taught this the evening before Election Day in 2016. The moment called for resilience building. Students felt powerless and anxious at the possibility of a fascist, homophobic person gaining power in the White House. And many of them were too young to vote, yet were completely lost about decisions being made about their future. We created patches that evoke symbols of resilience, both personal, historical, and pop cultural. Knives cut out linoleum stamps, a brayer rolled rich smelling oil ink, and we printed onto small swatches of fabric. No one looked at their phones because their fingers were coated in ink, and it offered us a reprise or a respite from a world that was changing around us. We talked about the power of mending in the Japanese art form of kintsugi, which is mending broken ceramics with gold leaf, and the lovingly patched and studded DIY battle jackets of the punk movement, both celebrating visible men's very proudly. My participants in the workshop made multiple patches that they could give to people. We brainstormed where we might incorporate this little piece of resilience into our daily lives. Is it sewn inside of a jacket, kind of secret and close to someone's heart? Is it beside a makeup mirror so you can see it every morning? Are you wearing it loud and proud? So it might invite conversation from others around this resilient symbol. Maybe it's a way of signaling something about your identity using the language of symbols. You are welcome to participate and explore resilient symbols and your favorite examples, or create your own through the Jamboard in the learning module. Thank you for taking time with me. Please connect with my learning module where you can find more, and don't feel free to contact me. Be safe and take care of yourselves, especially if you're an educator coping possibly with secondhand trauma. Take good care of yourselves. Bye.